This is a Zoom workshop for anthropological consultants working in native title on trade and commerce. It's delivered by Nick Peterson and David Trigger and is part of CNTA's current suite of professional development activities that due to COVID cannot be delivered face to face. Nick will outline first the classical literature, and David will focus then on contemporary matters, including how to deal with lawyers on these issues.
On behalf of CNTA, Julie and myself, and of course David Trigger, I welcome you all to this Zoom workshop on trade, exchange and commerce. Julie's outlined what's going to happen. I'm going to talk about the classical literature and issues it raises, and then David will go on and talk about how you go about demonstrating or seeking evidence for a right to trade. Until 2013, resources were only for personal and group use. They weren't allowed to be commoditized in any way and traded. And then we've had Akiba in the Torres Straits. We had in 2015 the Willis case, the case, in which Scott Kane produced an extensive sort of literature review and in relation to trade and exchange, which obviously that didn't go any further. And then in 2016, Jeff Stead again advocated for the right to use resources for any purpose in the Rumburia Borroloola claim group. He drew partly on some of the things Scott Kane had said and then some of his own evidence. And of course, being on the coast, he had the whole issue of the relationship with the Macassans. I'm not going to say any more about any of those. The thing that emerged from all of that is that you only have to show that there's a right to trade. You don't have to prove that people are actually involved in the activity, which makes life much easier, I guess, for many people. Okay, turning to the issue of terminology. You can think of the words that spring to mind: trade, barter, ceremonial exchange, trade routes, markets. And we realize that we've actually been quite sloppy in the way that we've used these. They're used in lots of different ways. People are just going on everyday understandings, but people's everyday understandings vary considerably. And if you look at Fred McCarthy's review article in 1939, he actually has trade in scare quotes in the title, and he uses barter in much of the text. So what are the issues around this? Now, anthropological thinking about the movement of items, about reciprocity, exchange, gifts, trade, is very heavily influenced by Mauss. And the idea of the obligation to give, the obligation to receive, and the obligation to return. And obviously, this is utterly fundamental to anthropology. It's a very influential insight of anthropology and has had enormous impact in the discipline. But of course, it doesn't exist the way in which things move about. I mean, you only have to think of demand sharing. That doesn't fit into a Maussian paradigm, nor does, in fact, sharing generally, because sharing isn't exchange, as Woodburn and other people have made, written about and emphasized. So there are more ways that things move than simply in terms of gifts and trade and barter in a reciprocal exchange kind of way. And what's wrong with that language is it prejudges the motivation and it prejudges what's happening. So it's really much better to talk about transfer. How do goods and things get transferred? And then that separates it out from Why do they get transferred? What is the motivation of the people transferring it? And of course, that motivation can vary very considerably from context to context and people to people. And if we think of a sort of ideal type sort of situation between an exchange or transfer, I should say, of pure related to pure use value of one end, and the other end pure gift or non-use value, then we can start to think about where things fit on that continuum. By pure use value, I mean that somebody has a desire or need for, say, petrol. They've got a car, they have a need, a utilitarian need for petrol. You've got somebody else who's got petrol, which they're happy to transfer, and a transfer takes place, right? At the other end, and it's a utilitarian practical exchange. And the pure gift at the other end, where, of course, the classic example of the pure gift is the Christmas card. Now, as we all know, since Malinowski, there's no such thing as the purely altruistic gift, because even where there's no use value for Christmas cards, people are making a choice about who they send them to. And in doing that, they're seeking to create or reproduce a social relationship. And I think that's really the key point. There is no transfer of items or goods which doesn't involve a social relation of some sort and maybe an important index of that social relationship. Because even where you have a purely utilitarian exchange, the issue of trust is important. You trust that if you go to buy petrol from somebody, that they're going to give you the amount you paid for and it's going to be of the quality you paid for. And the person who sells it to you trusts that the money you give them isn't fake, just to take one example. So with those sort of caveats, let's sort of move on to looking at some of the issues. Now, the issue with using the word trade is usually associated with money and profit. It can encompass barter, but it's usually today associated with money and profit. Well, there was no medium of exchange or store of value in that way. And nor was there largely because there wasn't money, there wasn't the ability really to make a profit. So it's really sensible to talk about barter, which is the exchange of goods, of one kind of goods for another. Another area where we're pretty kind of loose on language is ceremonial exchange. And this seems to be used in sort of three different kinds of ways, really. We've got ceremonial exchange where really holding a complex ceremony, which is the focus of which is exchange, it is one usage. And that is the usage that of the very good paper by Ron Berndt in 1951 on exchange in Western Arnhem Land. And you can think of Rom ceremonies in Eastern Arnhem Land, where that seems to be a good example of that. And then we've got another usage where groups of highly valued items are used in a kind of in a trading relationship with partners in the Daly River area, which has been written about first by Stanner under Murbock and by Falkenberg in his 1962 account. And those two accounts, Falkenberg and Stanner, remain two of the best documented exchange forms of exchange, detailed forms of exchange, along with the Berndt article. And then we have a third usage of ceremonial exchange where it's kind of contingent. It's in the shadow of a big ceremony. The people have gathered for some other reason. It allows them to exchange things on an individual basis. Sometimes at the end of a big ceremony, of course, there may be more formal exchanges where people are paying for services that have been delivered during the ceremonies. Now, another an aspect of exchange, which I think Stanner describes very well, is this, and I'll read it to you. Systems of simple barter between tribes have been reported from many parts of Australia, but they have been very inadequately studied. The primitive economics of the Aborigines have been so imperfectly recorded as a whole that complex institutions of the Murdoch type may well exist over a much wider area. The fact that they are not recorded and not reported proves very little, for the Murdoch does not obtrude itself upon the attention of the alien in the same way as the Melanesian Kula, which it in so many ways resembles. Now, I think the important point about this is that the way that these transfers take place in almost every case is between individuals, right? There are no traders in this system. There are no people who turn up at a location and put down dozens of pearl shells on the ground and wait for people to come forward to them. It's all done on the basis of kinship and partnership. Now, and that's very well described by Stanner with kinship diagrams. It's very well described by Falkenberg. It's referred to by Cabry. Those are really good sources on the referring to how the actual transfer takes place. So that then raises the question, what is a route of trade map, a map of trade routes? What do these arrows suggest? And what are they telling us about how things move? Well, they're telling us how the directions in which things move away from their center of origin, which is perfectly interesting and sensible. But if we look at this map here, it shows connections between where people are living. So from Broome to Columbaroo, or from Docker River into Warburton, etc., from where there are groups of people. But pre-colonially, people were spread across the landscape in a much thinner and more widely dispersed pattern. So we have to be a bit careful about the trade routes if that's taken in a kind of everyday colloquial way. Route has a kind of notion of road, and it's made more confusing if you read Stanner's article, because of course there were paths between areas all over Australia where people moved from an area where the population were living in a denser situation or in a band situation to a neighboring band. But basically, it was they were moving from hand to hand, right? From not by traders who were moving through the landscape and then setting up shop. And I think that raises another question, another body of literature that people refer to and gets a lot of running in the review of the traditional literature, is the movement of goods up and down the Western Queensland border, particularly of pituri and of ochre and of grinding stones. Now, and associated with that is often the word market. You read that in a number of sources. Howard would be a classic one, and he in fact is drawing on evidence that was given to him by Siebert, who was living at Kilapanana in northern South Australia. So what are these markets? Well, they were certainly not gatherings. Pre-colonially, I don't think there was any evidence to believe that people had gatherings of the sort that we understand by markets. That is, a people gathering simply to exchange goods and for no other purpose, right? For utilitarian purposes. I don't think there's any evidence for that. And if you actually look to see what Siebert said to Howard, the cases he described weren't like that at all. They were exchanges that took place partly in payment for services rendered at a ceremonial gathering, and partly in conjunction with those ceremonies, but but not part of the ceremony. So I think one's got to be a bit careful about how one draws on that language of markets, and not to assume that provides arguments for a bartering system which is very close to our system of trade. Okay. Now, I think there are kind of three kinds of evidence that one can draw on from the classical kind of literature. There's the archaeological evidence. And if you're working in the desert areas, this is brilliantly summarized by Mike Smith in his book. So he's sort of done all the work for you, right? And of course, it's quite clear to show that some of these things, particularly like millstones, were in fact highly utilitarian because they enabled people to use resources in areas where they didn't have appropriate flat stones for grinding. And those stones were often moved, transferred over very big distances. And the process of how they got there involves social relationships between trading partners and the like. And of course, because they involve trading partners, there's a social component, but I don't think there's any way that one could say that this wasn't a utilitarian exchange. It was for use value, and that use value is quite explicit because without them, the seed grinding economies of certainly west of Alice Springs couldn't have done without them, and out into the western desert where there weren't sources, ready sources for such stones. And then there are other kinds of things, stone knives, stone axes, which the same sort of argument can be made for, that people didn't have the stone for axes and knives. And then ochre. And of course, what has utilitarian value is obviously context dependent. If red ochre is essential to curing the sick and rubbing it on their body, just as we take aspirin, then it's acquiring ochre, however you acquire it, can be for a utilitarian purpose, or there's a utilitarian need. So I think it's not difficult to provide evidence for that. The second set of evidence is really ethnography that we could use not quite Ian Keen's phrase, at the threshold of colonization, but a lot of it is, but the ethnography up to the Second World War. We've got the classic ones are Roth and Philip Jones's very good commentary on that. I've got a bibliography at the end of this, and we'll put it up, and you can look up the things if you don't know them. You've got Kim Ackerman's account of pearl shell trading. I think you've got a very interesting number of papers about sacred boards. It's quite clear that there was a trade with Europeans on sacred boards around the Alice Springs area, that they were making them to trade, that there were huge surplus of sacred boards, partly because of the deaths from disease and mainly disease. Obviously, some people were killed, but it does seem mainly from disease. And if there are various articles looking at the huge numbers of these boards that are in museum collections, and that can really only be explained in terms of many of them having been produced for outsiders. And then you've got Donald Thompson's account of something that had finished before he really arrived there, but the exchange that was stimulated by the Macassans coming to the north coast. And of course, the people inland were very keen to get access to metal axes and pottery and cloth and other things which they heard about from the coast. And this stimulated them producing more stone spearheads from quarries, particularly the Nilipiji quarry in eastern Arnhem Land, and intensified the patterns of exchange there. And then there's the recent post-World War II evidence. Again, Kim's stuff here is interesting. I mean, as those who've read it, while the exchange of pearl shell has been going on for a long time, the exchange of engraved pearl shell is a post-1920 thing, and is actually very recent, according to him. And we've got the Falkenberg that I've already mentioned. I've published a very short bit on ochre, the exchange of ochre from this quarry here, where this is inside the Kargu, the Walbury red ochre mine. And that's been going for 35,000 years. And over 500 tons of ochre have come out of it, right? And people are still doing it. So that quantity doesn't suggest it was, even over that length of time, it was just for locals using it for health and curing rituals and other kinds of activity. And one can tell it's been used for that period because ochres have distinctive chemical signatures, and Mike Smith has excavated ochre from Kargu, 130, 150 kilometers south of the mine, 35,000 years ago. Much the best account that I've seen recently of exchange and is by Rob Payton, and I strongly recommend anybody who's interested in this to have a look at it. It's a very good article, and it's got lots of good stuff in it. Okay, so to wind up, in conclusion, if you're faced with the objection to your evidence that it's all gift exchange, as you may possibly be, I don't know, then I think the answer is that, of course, all transfers of any kind involve some kinds of social relations. But in the context of Australia, in the absence of chiefs and headmen, in the absence of villages, and in the presence of a very scattered and low density population, the whole issue of how a wider sociality is created and the way in which people were interconnected and the way that people got themselves together after fighting and feuding, and the way that polities were created involved, as we know, ceremonial life, and it involved exchange of women as wives, and the creating and renewing of social relationships through the exchange of things that people wanted and needed, often mainly for utilitarian purposes, but because they were rare and from other places, they were also things of value. And one of the very good things about Falkenberg's account is he shows how you can work out the value of pearl shells against blankets or against boomerangs or against other items, because in these areas where people trade, give gifts of bundles of valued items to people, they don't just hand the bundle on some months or years later. They take stuff out. They break the red ochre lump into half and substitute maybe a ball of white ochre that's from locally, or they take the boomerang out and put in a spearhead of some sort. So that even though there was gift exchange, people were making utilitarian use of the things, were extracting the things that had use value from them. And what's the thing that's principally missing is that there is no evidence of profit making, since really profit making requires a store of value and a medium of exchange. And that didn't exist. There's a lot more I could say about that, but I won't. And I'll hand over to David now. There are 3 pages there of basic references that if you don't know them, you'll find some of them helpful.
Okay, so briefly, some points here. This first slide, just to take us to where I think the legal approaches are to this any purpose rights question. I think there's an issue out there that the lawyers will still be working on as to whether this is actually a matter of evidence from an expert, or for that matter, from native title holders or claimants. Now, I say this based on some communications with several lawyers on different cases. So one point of view may be that this is a matter of legal approach rather than adducing further evidence. If it is to be a matter for evidence, then is it from native title holders themselves or claimants, or is it from experts? If the states and territory governments wish to contest this any purpose use issue, one view among some lawyers, I think, is that the burden of substantiating that laws and customs disallow certain usages, if you like, that is, encompass restrictions, that in fact they may argue that that burden of substantiating that aspect of law and customs sits with the respondent party rather than the native title holding party. If it is to be evidence, there's this issue that I think will confront researchers about what form from native title holders might such evidence be. For example, I have a quote there, you know, a person might give evidence, I was never taught that I can't use country for a certain purpose, or an expert may say, in my opinion, a certain usage is not part of laws and customs. But I put that up because I think, as with compensation, my reading of it is that this is very much in flux, the way lawyers will be approaching the matter, and therefore what terms of reference or briefs might go to anthropologists. Now, assuming that an anthropologist is engaged to carry out fieldwork on this question, the first dot point there, you know, just suggests what it might look like. I'm sure people in this session will have had some experience with this already. But the anthropologist will be asked whether at sovereignty and since sovereignty, rights have been exercisable for any purpose according to law and custom, traditional law and custom. So in my thinking about this and my brief attempts, that one question is what sort of fieldwork inquiries might be pursued for the anthropologist, by the anthropologist. And the third dot point there is taken particularly from the Rumburia decision at Borroloola, but based on, I think, other decisions such as in Pilkey as well, that the research is not about the question of whether country has ever been actually used for a particular purpose, whether that be phrased as commerce or anything else, but the matter of whether law and custom encompasses a right to do so. So we have this question of how such a right might be investigated without addressing concrete cases, or at least, I guess I'm suggesting that through the legal discourses, we see that they're not particular, they want the research to go to the nature of rights rather than addressing the facts of certain uses of country having actually been operationalized. Well, where does that leave the researcher? Is it a matter of trying to raise hypothetical cases? And I will say, I think that raising hypothetical cases on this issue may well lead to a fairly blank response, though that remains to be seen in different parts of the country. I should have added right at the beginning too, that while that rich material that Nick is taking us to pertains to the classical literature, of course, anthropologists on this matter will be being engaged for settings all across the continent where that subject matter that's available to us in the classical literature may or may not be a matter of knowledge and discussion among contemporary claimants. So we have to think about this in relation to claims in, Victoria and Southeast Queensland and Southwest Australia and so on, not just the more remote or traditional settings. I think the use of this concept of commerce and the term commerce, which has been put in some terms of reference in the early phases of lawyers trying to get anthropologists to write reports on this, well, that term and that concept may in fact be more of a distraction in terms of operationalizing inquiries through fieldwork than it is of conceptual usefulness. And so I suspect that the language is going away from including the term commerce in terms of reference and taking us much more to this question of whether traditional law and custom has any constraints about use for any purpose of country. In fact, the bottom dot point there is I'm asking whether introducing that term makes it difficult in fieldwork. And of course, partly because raising the question of whether you can make money out of country takes the research inquiries to current economic aspirations and history over the last 50 plus years of engagement with different industries in the Australian economy, as much as it takes us to questions of what traditional law and custom might say on the matter. And then, of course, we have those issues of change adaptation that will arise when trying to investigate what people are going to say about making certain uses of country for economic purposes, if you like. We will have the analytical issue about whether there are particular elements of those classical traditions that Nick's been presenting that may have been adapted now towards the idea of commercial use? And similarly, have we seen a sort of a concretizing of this idea of a lack of constraint on the use of country so that this idea of any purpose finds greater traction now than it may have done in the past? And then this interesting point that I haven't seen too many people raise, I don't think yet, but what in fact is the view across the continent about this idea of use for any purpose? It may well be that all cases have people positing that use for any purpose, including making money from country, arises quite well out of traditional law and custom. But I'm just asking there in those few dot points about other possible politics of indigenism whereby there's a discourse contrasting Aboriginal law with whitefella entanglement in purposes that is commercial use of country, which is posited as foreign to Indigenous culture. And the bottom dot point is about cases that I'm sure we all know about where there can be a vigorous politics of condemnation alongside possible celebration when people are seen as making money out of country using traditional culture, if I can put it that way, that as part of law and custom.